Boldwood presents The Soulmate, written by Rona Halsall and read by Catherine Manners. Chapter 1. Holly wandered through the shopping mall, killing time until her train from Glasgow to Dumfries was due. The sound of live music caught her attention, drawing her to a small crowd. They were gathered around a piano at the side of the plaza, watching a man play, and she stopped to listen. He was probably a few years older than her. His face was a bit too long, his mouth a little on the wide side, his nose larger than might be classed as attractive. But put all that together with his floppy blonde fringe, and the whole effect was quite beautiful. The way he played was bewitching, his fingers caressing the keys, putting so much care and meaning into each note. His dress code reminded her of Ed Sheeran, in his well-worn jeans and hoodie, but in a way that said he didn't really care about clothes or hairstyles. He was all about the music. He sang as he played, his eyes closing as he reached the high notes of the Coldplay anthem, Fix You. When it got to the line about tears streaming, her eyes stung, making her blink, a flush of emotion filling her chest. It never ceased to amaze her how music had the power to release emotions you didn't realise were close to the surface. But she recognised this sadness within, recognised that she, herself, and her life, come to that, could do with a bit of fixing. God knows she'd never taken the easy road. She edged closer, humming along, and then she found herself singing, unable to resist joining in. He looked up, surprised, and caught her eye. Oh my word, she thought. How can anyone have eyes that colour? They were the blue of a summer sky, giving his appearance a whole new dimension. When his face split into a grin, his eyes sparkled and she grinned back, captivated. Her heart racing like a horse galloping along a beach, tasting freedom and not wanting to stop. He had long, elegant fingers, she noticed, and as he played the introduction to his next song, he gave her a questioning look, silently asking if she knew it. She smiled and stepped closer, her hand on top of the piano now. Of course she knew it. This was her favourite song, the soundtrack to her life, Fly Away, by Lenny Kravitz. You have a lovely tone, he said. I heard you harmonising on that last song. You want to join me on this one? His voice was smooth and gentle, mellow as a fine wine. You take the lead if you like, and I'll do the harmonies this time. Take the lead? Could she? Did she have the nerve? It was a while since she'd sung in public, and she glanced around, wondering if anyone would be filming, because that would mean her answer would be no. But there were only a few people watching now, and no phones to be seen. It'll be fine, she reassured herself, the desire to sing and enjoy this unexpected moment overriding her need to hide her whereabouts. He'll never know, she whispered to the doubting voice in her head. Her palms were sweaty, but she was excited to have this opportunity. She'd loved performing when she was younger, before her life took a sudden turn. Okay, she nodded. I'll give it a go. What did it matter if she messed up? She didn't know any of these people, and singing was her release, a way to deal with everything that was going on in her life. Anyway, she was confident this guy had her back if she was struggling at any point. He had an aura of kindness about him. Her vocals soared, her eyes closing as she sang like she was feeling every single word, because she was. The lyrics echoed her feelings precisely. She wanted to get away. She needed to escape her life. She longed to have freedom. Her body felt like it was melting as their voices melded together in perfect harmony, so perfect it brought tears to her eyes. When they sang the last words and the final notes hung in the air between them, their eyes locked and something weird happened. Something she'd never felt before, like her heart had been jump-started. Did he feel it too? That connection, just the two of them, lost in their music? The sound of applause from passers-by broke the spell, and she blushed, covering her mouth with her hands, delighted by the enthusiastic reception and the shouts of more. She'd been so engrossed in her vocals she hadn't noticed how many people had stopped to listen. Her cheeks burned. Was it the applause? Or something to do with the way his eyes were fixed on her, never leaving her face as he played the introduction to another song for them to sing together? She wasn't ready for this moment to end and sang the next song with him too, letting him take the lead while she did the harmonies. After she'd played the final note, he stood and moved round the piano to stand next to her. He grabbed her hand, raising it up above her head, going for a theatrical bow. She laughed and joined in, his fingers entwined with hers in a way that felt natural and right. But it couldn't be right. She had Finn, didn't she? And God knows what he'd do if he found out she'd been singing with this man, let alone holding his hand. Chapter 2. "Oh, that was fun," he said, looking a little flustered as he released her hand from his grasp. "You've an amazing voice." She laughed, embarrassed and delighted, and more than a little bewildered. Nobody had said that about her voice before, but in another life she would have loved to have developed a professional singing career. Unfortunately, she'd burnt that bridge many years ago, and this was as close to public singing as she was ever likely to get. "So do you, and you play so well." The buzz from the applause was incredible, making her glow from head to toe. She hitched her bag on her shoulder and broke eye contact. "You just played my 3 favourite songs, which is kind of weird." It was probably time for her to go, to leave this encounter as something lovely to remember. But she couldn't get her feet to move. She wanted a little bit more. "Can I get you a coffee or something?" he said, glancing around. "There's a great coffee shop by the entrance over there." She flicked a glance at her watch and frowned, making a calculation, then flashed him a smile. "Okay, that would be nice. I've got a while until my train." "It's just a coffee," she told herself. "What harm can it do?" "Brilliant. I'm Mark, by the way." He grinned at her, and she felt herself melting inside, which was the loveliest sensation she'd ever experienced. "Oh, Holly." He leant to pick up his phone, which had been propped on the piano, and she realised with a jolt of nerves that he must have been recording himself playing. Oh God, what if he posts it online? What if Finn sees? She watched him pick up his bag and tuck his phone inside, trying to shake the negative thoughts from her mind. He'll never know, she reassured herself, thankful that Finn hated social media and thought Instagram was stupid. She was unwilling to let anything tarnish this encounter or spoil the moment. Who knew when she'd ever feel this way again? It was like she'd been sprinkled with stardust, and for once in her life something truly magical was happening. Of course, it was just a moment, she knew that. But she'd been feeling so down recently. This encounter had lit a spark of hope in her heart. Nice things did happen to people, and for once, they were happening to her. "So where's home to you?" he asked, as they walked towards the coffee shop, a sudden awkwardness wedged between them. "I live near Dumfries." She paused. "For the time being." "Where's that?" he laughed. "I haven't a clue about the geography of Scotland. I'm just passing through." "Oh, it's a couple of hours south of here on the train." She shrugged. "I've no idea what the actual distance is, though." She flashed him a smile, unnerved to find his eyes meeting hers. "I don't really know the geography of the area either. I haven't lived up here for long." "Ah, I didn't think you had a Scottish accent." "No, I come from further south." That was suitably vague, and she reminded herself to be more careful. One unguarded comment could get her into trouble. In fact, being with this man at all was a mistake. "Walk away," instructed the voice of reason in her head. But she'd no intention of being that sensible, not when she had the chance to enjoy the company of this lovely man for a little while longer. He opened the door of the coffee shop and held it for her, letting her enter first. Isn't that a nice, gentlemanly thing to do? Finn never opened doors for her, leaving her trailing behind him like a forgotten pet, something that always rankled. "Shall we sit by the window?" She pointed to an empty table and he followed her, letting her choose which seat she wanted, before putting his bag on the chair opposite. "I'll get this," he said, "as a thank you for your amazing performance." She laughed and blushed. Definitely a gentleman. "Okay, thank you. I'll have a hot chocolate, please. I think I've had enough coffee for one day." He went to the counter to get their drinks and came back with a couple of slices of cake to go with it. A sign, she hoped, that he was as keen to linger as she was. They chatted about music, and he told her he worked with music producers, making promotional videos for tours and new releases. But his hobby was going round the country playing on public pianos. Apparently there was a national directory, and he was gradually ticking them all off. "Is that like train spotting?" she said, getting a sudden attack of the giggles. "Because it was a bit of a nerdy thing to do in your spare time." Nerdy was okay, though. In fact, she liked nerdy. It was endearing and way better than arrogant and self-assured. As hobbies went, it seemed so wholesome, it made her like him even more. He laughed with her, a nice laugh, soft, not jarring. "Yeah, I suppose it is, and yeah, you guessed it, I'm a bit of a piano geek. They're all different, you see. They all have their own personalities, their own different sounds." He pulled his phone out of his bag. "I make recordings and put them up on my Insta page." He tapped and swiped at his screen. "Do you want to have a look at us singing?" Her heart started to race, her brain in a panic. "Would you mind not?" She grimaced. "The thing is, I'd rather you didn't post it on your page. I like to keep things private on social media." He gave her a curious look. "Okay, no worries. I understand not everyone wants me to share things, but I can send you a clip if you give me your Insta details." His eyes met hers, his fingers poised over his phone, waiting. "I'm happy to keep this just between me and you, if that's what you'd prefer." She sagged with relief. Nobody else would ever see. But a part of her wanted something concrete, a reminder of this lovely encounter. "Okay, here, give me your phone and I'll type it in for you." He shuffled round to sit in the seat next to her, watching as she put her details into his phone before handing it back. He sent her the clip, then played it, their heads bent together, his shoulder touching hers as they listened. She was mesmerised, not just by seeing and hearing herself, but also noticing the way he was looking at her as she was singing. She leant into him a little, revelling in the contact, the scent of him. No aftershave, just a natural male muskiness that made her want to grab him and give him a kiss. It was almost unbearable being this close, all her nerve ends tingling, but it was delicious at the same time. Surely he could feel what she was feeling. Like that sensation on the fairground ride when you're at the top of the track just before the big drop. His hand brushed hers and she didn't move away. Instead, her fingers curled round his. Think about Finn. She swallowed and pulled her hand away, thoughts of her boyfriend making her check the time. "Oh, my God," she gasped, glancing at the door. "I'm so sorry, but I've got to go. I'll be in so much trouble if I miss this train." She reached for her bag, slipping it over her shoulder as she started to stand. The cuff of her sleeve dropped a little, showing the bluish tinge of a bruise. The place where someone had held onto her wrist too tightly. She saw him notice, watched his jaw tighten, and she hurriedly pulled her cuff down, a wave of heat coursing through her body. "Can I have your number?" He looked hopeful, but she shook her head, eyes flicking towards the door again. "Sorry, no, that's..." She sighed. "It's not a good idea. Finn would go ballistic. He doesn't like me chatting to other men." She gave him a weak smile, silent for a moment, her hands holding the back of her chair, reluctant to let go. "It's been lovely meeting you. Really lovely." There was such an echo of regret in her voice. She was sure he must have heard it. He stood and grabbed his backpack. "The least I can do is walk you to the station." She smiled. "Okay, but it'll have to be more of a jog than a walk. I'm going to be late." He grabbed her hand as soon as they were out of the cafe and pulled her along, doing a running commentary, as if they were in some sort of televised sporting event. It was so funny she thought she might choke on her laughter, and they arrived at the station with 5 minutes to spare. Her cheeks were glowing, his too, and when their eyes met, she couldn't stop herself from reaching up and giving him a kiss. It was stupid and wrong and ever so right. His hand squeezed hers. He felt it too. She knew he did. "Keep in touch," he called as she backed away from him, her eyes fixed on his, her heart thundering in her chest. How could she not keep in touch when they had a connection she couldn't explain and didn't want to end? She sighed, her mind filled with one question and one question alone. What am I going to do about Finn? Chapter 3. Holly settled in her seat by the window, the train doors closing seconds after she'd got on board. Phew, that was close. Her heart was racing, not just because she'd had to run. Her spirits were soaring in a way they hadn't done since... She frowned, thinking for a moment before deciding she'd never felt like this before. It was better than being tipsy on drink, better than the excitement of a surprise or a holiday or an unexpected win. She smiled at her reflection in the glass. It was the best feeling ever, and she was going to hold it to herself and enjoy it for as long as possible. She had 2 hours on the train, and she would spend them reliving the last wonderful hour and a half of her life. It had been so nice to have a conversation with somebody other than Finn, someone who loved music and singing and knew all her favourite tracks, someone who knew nothing about her, all the horrors she'd left in the past. I bet Mark doesn't come home covered with blood. Finn was a gamekeeper at a large estate in Scotland. It had sounded romantic and unusual when he first told her, although she'd admittedly just polished off 3 double gins at the time. Had she known exactly what his job entailed, she might have thought twice about starting a relationship with him. But here she was, stuck with a man who took delight in killing animals and was so possessive and jealous, he hardly let her out of his sight. She gazed out of the window, the glass blurred by the splatter of rain. A bank of grey clouds filled the horizon, hiding the mountains from view, making the evening prematurely gloomy. Yet another rainy day. There had been so many recently, but it was autumn and to be expected, although it felt like the weather was in tune with her general mood. Her thoughts shifted back to Mark, and she smiled to herself, knowing she would feed off their meeting for quite some time. It was her secret, and she'd hold it close, like a precious gift, taking it out in quiet moments to unwrap and experience all over again. She pulled her phone out of her bag and opened the clip he'd sent her, slipping on her headphones so she could turn up the sound. Her mind filled with the words of the song, and the man she'd just met. Mark. A good, solid name for a surprising person. All unassuming on the outside, but a musical genius underneath. The tone of his voice was caramel smooth, his piano playing gentle and evocative, and as she listened to their voices harmonizing, it brought goosebumps to her skin. She used to sing all the time growing up, being in a band at school with a bunch of her mates. They were all pretty rubbish, but it had been a lot of fun, and she'd been infatuated with the lead guitarist. He'd been a couple of years older, and her parents didn't approve, but she was 15 and rebellious, and nobody could tell her they shouldn't be together. Until the incident that had ruined her life. Looking back, she supposed it was inevitable that her behaviour would lead to trouble, but she hadn't quite anticipated how much trouble, and how it would hound her like a tracker dog, constantly driving her on, making her into a nomad. She huffed, aware she only had herself to blame, but at the time, she'd been a foolish teenager who didn't know anything. And it seemed grossly unfair that one slip-up had tainted her entire life from that moment forwards. A tear rolled down her cheek, quickly followed by another. Why couldn't she have met Mark earlier? Why had she chosen to be with someone like Finn? But the answer to that was simple. Finn had been in the bar that night, not Mark, and he'd been her only choice. She felt the weight of her bag on her lap and remembered her secret mission, the reason she'd been in Glasgow. She pulled out the envelope and reached inside for the brand new passport, turning to the back page. It was a horrible photo, but definitely her, unlike the name next to it, which wasn't hers at all. She closed it and stroked the cover like it was precious. And it was. Its value beyond money. Because this gave her options that she didn't have before. This gave her the chance of freedom. Her jaw hardened as the image of her boyfriend loomed large in her mind, pushing Mark out of the way. Finn. Her feelings for him were a muddle of conflicting emotions. Her mind a jumble of images and words that she found impossible to untangle. In recent weeks, they'd been going through a bad patch, always arguing, and she'd felt increasingly trapped. He got so frustrated with her. His body language left her in no doubt that he wanted to strike out. Fortunately, he never had. But he did grab her by the wrist and pin her against the wall to make her listen, shouting into her face. That had driven her desire to get a passport. All she had to do now was get enough money together and then, for once, she'd actually have a choice. Chapter 4. Mark stopped at a service station on the long drive back home to North Wales. He bought himself a sandwich and a coffee and found a table where he could sit undisturbed for a little while. From the moment he'd left her at the station, wistfully watching her disappear into the crowd, his head had been buzzing with thoughts of Holly. Oh my God, she was perfect. Everything about her. She had the sweetest singing voice, a cute smile, a grace when she moved. She was long-limbed and lithe, only a little shorter than him, with matching blonde hair and blue eyes. Except her eyes were paler, like ice crystals that twinkled when she smiled. And that laugh! It was almost musical. She was the one, he was sure of it, the woman he was destined to be with. He'd felt it in her kiss, that fleeting, beautiful touch of her lips. How magical that had been, and so unexpected. His lips still tingled at the thought. He chuckled at himself, aware that some would consider it a fanciful, romantic notion, but he believed in love at first sight. Hadn't that been the story of his own parents' relationship? Well, at least that's what his mum had told him. Unfortunately, he had very few memories of his dad, who died in a farming accident when he'd been helping a neighbour. His mother had never told him the exact details, but the expression on her face whenever he'd brought up the subject was pure horror, which made him assume it was a gory end. For most of his life, it had just been him and his mum, and he'd felt comforted by the stories she told him about his dad, and what a wonderful, warm human being he'd been. How he'd swept her off her feet from the moment they'd first met in a baker's shop in Bala. She was behind the counter serving, and he'd come in to buy a pasty for lunch. Then he'd waited all afternoon for her to finish work, and had taken her out for dinner, and they hadn't spent a day apart after that. Married within 3 months, and Mark on the way just a few months later. His dad was 10 years older than his mum, and had his own cottage, the place where Mark had grown up and lived for most of his life. He liked to think he was following in his dad's footsteps, a chip off the old block. And now he too had fallen in love at first sight. Or should that be first sound? Because it was Holly's voice that had touched his heart initially. He finished his sandwich and pulled his phone out of his bag, watching the video of them singing together one more time. When he got home, he'd tweak the sound a bit and do some editing, and then he could send her a better version. It was a shame he couldn't put it on his Insta page, but a promise was a promise. She was clearly a private person, and he felt there was a story behind that. Looking at her Instagram profile, he could see she'd posted regularly until 7 months ago, and then nothing new since, which was odd. The last picture she'd posted was a selfie with a group of women, all eating something. The caption said, "My first brandy snaps worked a treat. Got to test them, haven't you?" With a winking emoji. So she could cook as well. How fabulous was that? He settled back in his seat and played the video once again before he plucked up courage and sent her a direct message. "So lovely to meet you today. You made a nerdy pianist very happy. Hope the train home isn't too slow. Keep in touch. Kiss, kiss, kiss." Were 3 kisses too much? He wasn't sure, his finger hovering over the send button. 1 kiss was friend zone territory, and he wanted to show her she meant more to him than that. He shook his head and pressed send. Sod it. Who dares wins? No point being too reticent. Or did 3 kisses come over as presumptuous or arrogant? He was starting to feel a bit hot, worried that he got this wrong. But it was done now. He'd just have to wait and see what she said. He sipped at his coffee, still unsure. Why was it so hard to know what to do in these situations? Other people didn't seem to have the same problems as him. But reading women's body language or picking up the subtext of conversations did not appear to be in his skill set. He played their whole encounter back in his mind, feeling it all in the core of his being. Their eyes meeting, their skin touching, the way she laughed at his jokes, listened to what he was saying, her reluctance to leave, her hand holding his, the kiss. However bad he was at reading the signs, surely to God all that suggested she was interested in him. "She has a boyfriend," the voice in his head reminded him, always ready to damp down the flames when his heart caught fire. They always have bloody boyfriends. That was the trouble when you got to your 30s. Everyone was already taken. But he wondered if she was happy. In his mind's eye, he could see the bruise on her wrist. A nasty bruise, dark blue. It would have taken some force to create a bruise like that. A level of force that wasn't normal in a healthy relationship. And from what she'd said, her boyfriend was the jealous type, which couldn't be an easy thing to live with. He let his mind wander off, creating a scenario where she told him she wanted to leave, but couldn't, and he was the one who saved her. Call him a romantic, but these things did happen. If he kept in touch and continued chatting to her, who knew where it could lead? He played them singing the Lenny Kravitz song one final time before he got on his way again. That would always be their song now. And he was determined to make her wish come true. He'd help her get away, if that's what she wanted. And then they could fly away together. Chapter 5. Holly must have dozed off because she woke with a start, the passport in her hand. The train had stopped, and she jumped to her feet, thinking for one awful moment that she should get off, until she heard the announcement and realised it wasn't her stop. Flopping back in her seat, she stuffed the passport into the envelope and tucked it at the bottom of her bag. It would open a whole new world to her, and she had to think of a safe place to stow it, until she'd made up her mind about leaving and had a plan in place. For the first time in her life, she had formal identification. She could travel. And that gave her the option to escape from the latest hole she'd dug for herself. In fact, she could draw a line under her life to this point, move abroad, and start again. Properly this time. It was an exciting prospect, but it also felt quite daunting, and maybe it was a step too far just now. It would be easier to get a job now she had ID, one that paid a decent wage, instead of the cash-in-hand work she'd tended to take, where you were open to exploitation because people knew there was something a bit dodgy about you. Her previous lack of ID had forced her to travel up and down the country, chasing seasonal work. Until 4 years ago, when she'd landed a job at a hotel in Buxton in the Peak District, and life had started to look up. The manager, Sophia, was very maternal, originally from Spain, and had taken a liking to Holly. She'd been desperate for staff, and had given her work in the kitchens, provided her with living accommodation, and trained her as a sous chef. "If you know your way around the kitchen, you'll always have a job," she'd said, as she showed Holly how to chop vegetables without slicing her fingers. She'd pointed the knife at her, a serious glint in her eye. "When I first came to the UK, I had nothing except my cooking, and look at me now. I have a whole hotel." She never asked Holly for details about her past, and with her guidance, Holly blossomed. At last she felt safe. And because she'd been in one place for years instead of the usual months, she'd been able to get her passport photo signed by her GP to say they were a true likeness. Unfortunately, she'd had to leave before she could send her application in, and it was only recently that she'd been able to complete the paperwork and attend an interview at the passport office. Things had been going great at the hotel until Greg joined as head chef. She huffed at the very thought of him, her body giving an involuntary shudder. It was his fault she'd had to leave. His fault she'd found herself trapped in a gamekeeper's lodge in the grounds of the castle in Dumfries. A frustrated growl stuck in her throat, and she shook the image of Greg from her mind, not wanting to give him the opportunity to poison the glow of optimism the day had given her. He was in the past. Hopefully. Nobody at the hotel knew where she'd gone, not even Sophia, because she'd just taken off in the middle of the night and ended up in Scotland. At the time, Dumfries had seemed like a random enough destination, and there was sufficient distance between her and Greg to feel comfortable. But instead of having Greg's wandering hands to worry about, she now had Finn's temper. She'd wondered about picking up her passport and not going back to Finn, but decided against it because she didn't want a repeat of the mess she'd found herself in before. It was hard being in a new place with little or no money, forced to make significant compromises just to keep a roof over her head and food in her belly. This time, if she was going to leave, she wanted to go on her own terms, in her own time, when she had sufficient funds to make the transition. Just a couple more months. She could manage that, couldn't she? Her eyes dropped to her wrist, the edge of the bruise poking out from her cuff. She shuffled in her seat, shifting her gaze to the window, tracking the raindrops that snaked down the glass. Last week was the first time he'd ever hurt her. Yes, there'd been arguments, sharp words, attempts to kick dents in her self-confidence, but nothing physical. It was confusing because the guy was so lovely most of the time, and then she just had to say the wrong thing or not keep up with the housework, and it was instant combustion. It came out of nowhere, and it seemed to disappear just as fast, like a tornado twisting through town, leaving a trail of wreckage in its wake and sunny skies overhead. It's not right, she told herself, massaging her bruised wrist, feeling a jab of pain. He'd done that to her for burning the edges of a lasagna she'd made. "I can't eat that," he'd snapped, his lip curling as he stared at the dish she'd pulled out of the oven and set on the hob. She frowned, annoyed he was making such a fuss. He was behaving as if she was asking him to eat a tin of dog food, not a painstakingly created lasagna. And it was only a bit singed round the edges, nothing major. "How hard is it to keep an eye on the meal when it's cooking? That's not like you've anything else to be doing, is it?" That was a dig at the fact she wasn't working. The irony being it was how he wanted things to be. There were cash-in-hand jobs available locally, but he'd kept telling her she didn't need to go out to work. He was going to look after her, and in return he expected her to look after him. The fact that it wasn't an arrangement she wanted didn't seem to matter, but they'd argued about it a few times now, and she'd learned it was an argument she would never win. Looking at the singed lasagna, her mouth twisted to the side. "It's just the edges that have caught. You can have this middle bit. Look, it's fine." She dug the serving spoon in, putting a generous portion onto his plate, giving herself the burnt edges. He was sitting at the table expectantly, a napkin already spread out on his lap. He had surprisingly old-fashioned views for a 30-year-old man and liked the table to be set properly, like his mum had always done. She'd been a housewife as well, and it seemed Holly was judged against her standards and found lacking. She put their plates on the table and sat down opposite him, biting back her urge to tell him not to be so picky. He still looked angry, and her stomach roiled, the muscles in her neck tensing as she watched him take a first mouthful, then scrub his face and spit the food back out onto his plate. "That tastes burnt. The whole thing is tainted." He pushed his plate away in disgust. "That's inedible." "No, it's not. There's nothing wrong with it. It took me ages to make, and it's only a little bit overcooked. I can't believe it tastes—" She yelped as he reached across the table and grabbed her wrist with his shovel-sized hand. "Stop it, Finn, you're hurting me!" She squirmed, wincing as his grip tightened, tears springing to her eyes. "Don't you tell me what's edible and what's not." He flung her arm back at her, making her tip back in her chair. She reached out to grasp the table, but only managed to grab the cloth, pulling the plates and drinks and cutlery with her onto the floor. He stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Her lovingly crafted meal splattered across the tiles. Thinking about it now, she knew things had changed after that. No matter how many times he apologized, no matter how many bunches of flowers he brought her, something in her heart had hardened. But more than that, she realized she was scared. His mood swings frightened her. Chapter 6. She gazed out of the window as the train sped along the tracks, daydreaming about a new future and what it might look like. Sunshine would be nice. She could almost feel the heat on her face as she imagined sunlit plazas and golden beaches, turquoise seas and the smell of suntan lotion. Flights to Spain were dirt cheap, and she'd learnt a lot from Sophia about the best places to live, how things worked over there. She'd even learnt some common phrases. Yes, Spain, she decided, as she watched the rain-soaked landscape slip by. Music permeated her brain, memories from the afternoon butting into her daydream. Mark. It was impossible to explain her feelings, but her heart raced every time she thought about him, a glow suffusing her body. Their connection was undeniable. But it was more than that. It felt significant. The way he'd looked at her had given her goosebumps. When had anyone ever been that attentive? When was the last time anyone had properly listened to what she was saying? He'd really heard her. And when they'd been chatting, even though they'd only just met, it felt like they'd known each other for years. And then, that kiss. She sighed, reliving it all over again. If she'd been Sleeping Beauty, that kiss would definitely have woken her up. It was hard to say what made it so special, but her lips were still tingling. How often would something like that happen in her lifetime? It had been magical. Yes, that was the word. Magical. Her phone pinged with a notification, and she took a look, smiling when she saw it was a message from Mark. How sweet of him. And there were 3 kisses. 3. She hugged her phone to her chest, knowing now that Mark had felt it too, that connection between them. She hadn't been imagining it. Another ping. Another message from Mark. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I couldn't help seeing that bruise on your wrist. And I just wanted to say that I have a car, and if you ever need to get away for real, I will come and get you. I can't bear to think of anyone hurting you. Kiss, kiss, kiss. Her heart melted. He really did seem the kindest guy. She was a bit ashamed that he'd noticed the bruise and jumped to a conclusion, but the fact that he would help her made her feel stronger somehow. Perhaps she wasn't stuck in this situation on her own anymore. Perhaps she had an ally. She typed a message back. That's so kind, but I think it was a misunderstanding. The bruise, I mean. I dunno, but thanks for the offer. She hesitated before adding 3 kisses. Almost instantly, another message pinged onto her phone. A picture of 2 people hugging. No worries. I just want you to know you've got a friend in me. Kiss, kiss, kiss. If only she was with a guy like Mark. He'd sense there was a problem. He was a man with emotional intelligence. How rare was that? What if he was the guy she'd been waiting to meet her whole life? Her destiny, could that be true? Had fate stepped in to help her? There was an ache in her heart, a longing for a normal life. A life where she could stop running and put down roots. A life where she could make proper friends and go back to being Erin Stamper rather than pretending to be Holly Rhodes. Chapter 7. Holly was 32 now, and had been calling herself Holly for exactly the same amount of time as she'd previously been Erin, her birth name. 16 years. Now it felt natural to be called Holly, and her passport said she was Holly, so that's who she was, and nobody in this world apart from her and a youth worker in Birmingham knew any different at this point in time. Erin was the past she wanted to forget. Holly was the future. The train pulled to a halt, and she realised with a start that this was Dumfries, her stop. The journey was still unfamiliar, this only being the third time in her life she'd arrived at the station. She jumped up and hurried down the carriageway to the nearest door, taking a deep breath as she mentally prepared her story. Finn was waiting in the car park, his vehicle unmistakable, with the Castle Drum Lanrig logo. It was a pickup truck, the back fitted out with dog crates for the Labradors and Spaniels that went along to the shoots with the gamekeepers. When the dogs weren't working, they lived in kennels at the back of the cottage, never allowed inside or treated like pets in any way. Something Holly was glad about because she was a bit scared of dogs, much preferring cats. He was leaning against the cab, smoke curling from a roll-up pinched between his finger and thumb. He was a big man, a typical brawny Scot with Viking jeans in his makeup somewhere. He was wearing a baseball cap, his ginger hair curling from under it at the back, a thick beard covering half his face. Despite it being autumn and really quite chilly, he was dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, his tattooed arms bare. He looked like the sort of man you wouldn't want to pick a fight with, and she supposed that's what had attracted her to him. She'd seen him as her protector, thought he was a hard man with a soft centre. That's how he'd come across when they first got together. A big softy, and she'd been proud to be his girlfriend. For a short while, anyway, until she'd started to understand exactly what she'd got herself into. "At last," he said in his Scottish drawl when he spotted her. "I've been waiting for ages." His eyes met hers, and her shoulders tensed. That steely glint, a tick by his right eye, usually heralded trouble. She ran her tongue round dry lips, flashed him a smile, trying to behave as if she hadn't noticed, as if everything was fine. "There was a delay on the line, something to do with signals," she said, hearing the tremor in her voice, her hands holding her bag a little tighter. "How is your mother?" He emphasised the last word. She didn't dare break eye contact, but she could feel a blush warming her face, and hoped he wouldn't notice in the dim light. Keep calm, just keep it together, she cautioned herself. "She's a lot better, thanks, but they're keeping her in hospital for more tests." "And what exactly is wrong with her? I'm not sure you said." His eyes were boring into hers, and she hesitated a beat too long, her mind unable to pick a specific illness from a myriad of options. "A stroke," she gabbled. "It was a stroke." "Right." He nodded and took a last drag on his roll-up before flicking the stub across the car park. The slap caught her unawares, sending her head snapping to the side, a burning pain pulsing in her cheek as she staggered against the truck. "You lying bitch," he snarled. She edged backwards, but he grabbed her jacket in his fist, pulling her so close she could feel his spittle on her face when he spoke. "I know you've been to the passport office. Do you think I'm stupid? I've got a tracker on your phone. I knew I couldn't trust you." He opened the truck door and hurled her inside like she was a sack of dog feed, before grabbing her bag and throwing it on the back seat. There was a second or two, while he was walking round the truck to get in the driver's seat, when she could have run. A moment of opportunity that she missed because she was in shock, lying across the front seat, completely disorientated and paralysed by fear. "He's got a tracker on my phone." Her heart did a double beat, her pulse pounding in her ears. That's what he'd just said. It had never occurred to her that he'd stoop so low. Never for 1 minute had she imagined she no longer had freedom of movement. There'd be more questions, she was sure of it, when they were in the privacy of his home. Now that he'd hurt her once, it seemed he'd broken through a mental barrier, and there was nothing to stop it happening again. She was shaking, so scared she couldn't move. The slap was just for starters, but it signalled an ending for her as well. If she'd had doubts about leaving before, she had none now. It was just a question of when and how. She closed her eyes, imagining she was holding Mark's hand. He'd come, he said he would. But does he mean it, or is it just words? It was a big ask, and they'd only just met. And was any man reliable in this sort of situation? She pushed herself into a sitting position, her face still throbbing, tears stinging her eyes. She was going to have to be more careful about everything. Delete Mark's messages. The video of them singing. "Get your seatbelt on," Finn said pleasantly, like nothing had happened. "We don't want you getting hurt now, do we?" Chapter 8. The next morning, Mark gasped when he saw the picture of the handprint on Holly's cheek. His jaw dropped as he read her message, appalled that things had escalated so quickly. "Look what he did to me last night. He slapped me when he picked me up from the station because I went to the passport office and didn't tell him that's where I'd been going. He put an app on my phone to track me." If blood could actually boil, his would be bubbling away right now. He studied the picture. That was a massive handprint covering most of Holly's cheek. It made him wonder how big this Finn guy actually was. But from the scale of the picture, he would say he must be at least 30% bigger than Mark. Without a doubt, he would be stronger because Mark was a musician and more of a greyhound than a Rottweiler. He puffed out his cheeks, his mind in turmoil. But at least he knew what he was up against now and could plan accordingly. No direct confrontations with Finn. That was a given. He tried to remember what Holly had said about her partner, but he couldn't recall very much. She'd said he was a gamekeeper and they lived on an estate near Dumfries, but she'd been a little cagey about precise details. He wondered how many estates there might be in that area and did a quick Google search. Well, that was a surprise. Apparently there were quite a few. He made himself a coffee and sat down to respond to Holly's message. He'd had time to think about things now, and he knew he needed to get some essential jobs done at home before he could go and rescue her, if that's what she wanted. But why else would she send him that picture? Domestic abuse was not a subject you'd casually chat about to a virtual stranger. It wasn't something that didn't matter, that he couldn't ignore. No, this was clearly a cry for help. It took him a little while to get his wording right, typing and deleting several times, tutting at his ineptitude. Keep it simple.